So today I'm taking my first look at a Bulgari. I've never kind of spent any extended period of time with this specific watch or this brand in particular, and I think it's a fun one. So kind of let's take a closer look. We have a diameter of 40 millimeters, lug to lug of 45.9, height of 6.6, and a lug width of what seems to be 30 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch, we're going to have the caliber BVL138 movement in here. It is a in-house Bulgari movement. It is a micro rotor, as you can see. It is considered one of the thinnest time-only automatics in the world, which is pretty cool. And as you can see, what's really nice is it does take up a lot of the case back. It is beautifully finished. There's a bunch of nice bridges. There's perlaging under the micro rotor, and it's undoubtedly a very nice movement to look at. We do have 100 meters of water resistance with a screw down crown, which is really nice to see for a watch this thin. Sapphire crystal on the front and back. What's really nice too is the movement does have a 60-hour power reserve. It does beat out at a lower beat rate of around 21,600 vibrations per hour, which is about 3 hertz, but because it's a sub-seconds register, you don't really notice it that much. We do have a sapphire crystal on the front and back, no loom on the watch at all. We do have 100 meters of water resistance with a screw down crown, which is nice to see for such a thin watch. And last but not least, the watch does retail at $12,200 directly from Bulgari. Starting with the dial of this watch, and it is fairly simple but pretty well done. We do have a kind of flat matte black dial to the watch. The hands are sword style hands, but they are skeletonized in the middle. There are no loom signatures anywhere on this watch. We have numerals at the 12 and the 6 and batons everywhere else, but the 7 and the 8 are omitted for this sub-seconds register, which there's nothing special about it. It is just a printed sub-seconds track with a similar sword style hand for the seconds counter. Very, very minimal text on this watch. We just have Bulgari or Bulgari, however you want to say it, and Swiss made at the very bottom at the 6 o'clock here. It's nice that they kept the text pretty minimal. I think because you have the branding at 12 and the sub-seconds and just the numeral at 6, it is pretty well balanced as it is. The actual indices themselves also go pretty far into the middle of the dial, so it doesn't look empty in any way, I don't think. The dial is clean, it's simple, it is really nicely framed too by this little octagonal opening here that cuts away slightly into the dial. It's a very modern look to it. It's very aggressive, but somehow still gentle in a way, I think because of the circular outer bezel. Really good design, really simple. I think one of the main qualms I would have about the dial is the fact that the indices don't have much depth to them, or they're not multifaceted. They seem to be just pretty much one-dimensional, pretty flat. They do catch the light very, very nicely and they shine bright, but at certain angles you just get almost a completely black, kind of almost uninteresting looking watch. And had there been more facets, I think that would have looked a little bit better. Zooming in a little bit closer to the watch, we do see that the Bulgari logo is very, very nicely printed. There is a good amount of depth to the logo itself, so that's nice to see. Arguably, it almost seems a little bit more three-dimensional than the markers do themselves. They are very flat markers, and I think obviously that is a design choice, but it's not one that I love personally. Looking at the hands themselves, the story is a little bit different. There's a lot of smudging and specks and kind of roughness along them. It's a little bit surprising, especially because the hands are such a major aspect of this design, I would say, that it's kind of so carelessly finished. I would have definitely expected a little bit better at this price point above $10,000. The shape of the hands are nice, they are multifaceted, and I think that the indices should have followed that a little bit. If the hands have 2 facets, the indices should have maybe had something similar. Looking at the sub-seconds hand, again, it still has that same dustiness and dirtiness a little bit. It is also 2-faceted, and it looks nice, but not greatly finished. Small imperfections along some of the markers as well. I think because they're overall thinner surfaces, there's not too many places to go wrong, but I think this watch is not the best finished at all. The dial texture itself looks pretty cool. It's almost like a close-up of coal. There's like darker and lighter spots of black, and depending on what angle you get it, it goes either very black or a little bit lighter black-gray in a way. But overall, I think the dial, especially on macro, is a little bit of a letdown. Looking at the case itself, I think this is one of the probably most interesting points about this watch, maybe outside of the movement. It is very much an integrated looking design with what is a 30mm bracelet here at the lugs, going all the way down to 20mm at the end links here. So a very, very dramatic 10mm taper, and I don't think it's super noticeable on wrist. I think it's nice that they at least try to take some of the visual heft out of the watch by thinning out the bracelet so much. One thing to note too is it does catch the light very nicely. You do have a very nice vertical brushing along the bracelet and these kind of center links that are highly polished. As it moves in the light, it really catches and it plays and it just looks cool. And it's nice to see. Looking a little bit more generally at the case, we do have a somewhat outward going brushing pattern to the actual bezel itself here. And then the rest of the tops of the case here are circularly brushed. You do have little tiny breaks of high polish here, which is nice. When the case kind of steps down to the lug, you do have a little high polished angle there. And when similarly the lug kind of breaks down at this 45-degree angle, give or take, it is all high polished on this surface. What's nice about the way the kind of top portion is polished is that it really does catch the light nicely. As you kind of move it very gently, those tiny little portions that are peeking out tend to just catch the light, play with the light, and look very interesting. It is a watch that no doubt does catch your attention, and because it's so large, it will catch pretty much everyone's attention. What's somewhat hard to notice is you do have this gentle octagonal shape that not only continues on the inside of the dial, but slightly on the outside of the bezel too. And it is highly polished, so it does catch the light a little bit, as you can see there. So it is a very industrial, just geometric shape to almost every aspect of this watch. It's interesting, it's unique, it's not quite a complete Gerald Genta derivative. It's nice to see that it is somewhat its own thing. Looking at the case side, we do have horizontal brushing. I believe this is a ceramic inlay for the crown here. Very, very thin case. It's kind of crazy that this is a watch with a 60-hour power reserve and it's basically like 6.5mm thin. It's pretty wild. And it's nice to see that the bracelet in a similar vein is very, very thin as well. Thin, comfortable, and so much so that with the deployant clasp, you actually have to have these tiny little inside links where the mechanism will fold into to kind of make it a little bit more flush as a bracelet, which I think is a really nice engineering touch. Looking at the movement here, it is beautifully decorated. We do have classic Geneva striping. We have the micro rotor here. We have the nice balance wheel beating away here. So it is a nice thing to look at. It's cool because it's such a large movement. It's not really common to see such a large movement in modern watches. And it's nice that even though this watch is large, Bulgari really built this movement to fit into this case, or vice versa. Really quickly, before taking a closer look at the movement, we just have a classic friction fit butterfly deployant here with the Bulgari logo on this tiny little clasp here, or tiny little link. Nothing crazy, nothing mind-blowing. I would have liked to see a slightly better clasp, but it's functional, it works, it keeps it fairly thin, so can't complain too much, but again, I think for the price, I expect slightly better. And similarly, I don't know if it's because the bracelet's fairly thin, but instead of screw links, we have a kind of pin and collars, which is interesting to see at this price point. Taking a look at the movement here, it's nice to see that it is almost better finished than the dial side is, which is a little unfortunate because this is the side you don't see. But you have all these very nice plates going on, you have a lot of jewels on display, you have a very, very visible balance wheel here and the kind of pallet fork beating away underneath, which is pretty cool to see. This is a nice looking movement. You have these tiny little perlage in there, you have a bunch of gears on display. And of course, as you can see there, this platinum micro rotor. It is a very nice looking movement, it's very nicely decorated. Moving on to how the Bulgari wears, earlier I was wearing this Cartier tank, and the Bulgari is going to look very large by comparison, so I'm going to put on a 40mm watch really quick just so you can get a better comparison. Here is a 40mm Seiko on my 6.5-inch wrist, and very shortly we will see the 40mm square Bulgari. Here we have the Bulgari on my 6.5-inch wrist. As you can see, it is a fairly large watch. There's no two ways about that, but because you do have the short lug to lug distance and it's kind of in this integrated styling, I don't think it looks terrible by any means. It will definitely stand out. It definitely has a lot of wrist presence. It is very almost equivalent to a dressy Panerai in a way. It takes up a lot of wrist real estate, and it definitely would be suited more to someone with a 7-inch wrist, 7.5-inch wrist, maybe even 8-inch wrist, whereas my wrist, isn't quite the intended audience for this watch. It still is fairly comfortable for how geometric it looks. It doesn't really dig into the wrist in any weird or wrong way. The crown is pretty small and out of the way, so it doesn't dig at all. It is very, very thin, so there's really no issues there with the height or bulkiness or heaviness of the watch in any way. So it is a really, really pleasurable watch to wear overall. It just is very large. Taking a quick look at the crown here, it is really smooth as you unwind it. It's smooth to wind it back in, and it's a really nice experience for the winding. Very, very clicky, very smooth, super audible. I mean, I don't know if you can hear that. So yeah, not too bad on the crown there, and for how small it is, you can actually grip it pretty well, which is nice to see. Looking at the side view of the watch there, it isn't the most ergonomic case ever because there's not a lot of turn down to it, but it is super thin, so it doesn't necessarily need a bunch of ergonomics. It just needs to not be super, super flat. So it does wear nice on wrist. It feels comfortable. And if you have a larger wrist than mine, it probably will look much better on you. And then just one last thing, you can kind of tell that it tapers pretty dramatically even on my smaller wrist where not a lot of the bracelet is showing. With someone with a flatter wrist, you'd probably be able to tell even more, and I think that'd probably be a really nice look to it. So that's just something to keep in mind. It does have a pretty dramatic taper, and if you're not into that, just take note. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros it's just unique. The design doesn't quite look like anything else out there. Sure, you can say it is Genta-esque, but even then, it does it in its own way, I feel. It is extremely thin, which is just, I guess, a cool aspect about it. It wears well despite its size, and I don't think it would be mistaken for any other watch on your wrist, which is something that's hard to do. From kind of across the room, some watches really do blend together and look alike, but to have a design that stands out on its own is cool. And speaking on the case itself for a second, it's just really well designed. It has a lot of angularity to it. It has just a lot of unique architecture in the design. Overall, I just think they did a good job designing this watch, designing the bracelet, and making it look like nothing else out there. Furthering a point that I already had, it is a comfortable watch. It looks very angular, but it doesn't dig into the wrist in any way. It's pretty light on wrist, and overall, it's kind of a pleasure to wear even though it's large. Like again, I don't think it fits my wrist particularly well, but as long as you have a bigger wrist than mine, you probably won't have any issues wearing it, and it will just feel nice on wrist. And lastly, I think a big pro for this watch is the movement. Again, it's one of the thinnest automatics that exist. It is well finished, it looks nice, and thankfully you are paying a lot of money for it, but I think it's fairly well deserved at that price point. Could they offer it for cheaper? I'm sure they could. But that's kind of not the point, and thankfully the movement doesn't let you down in many ways. Now moving on to cons, and there are kind of more than I would have expected originally. One of the biggest ones for me is just the finishing on the dial itself. For a watch that's over 10 grand, it's not very well finished in my opinion. Do you see most of the marks from surface level? No, not at all. And even after seeing them on the macro, I didn't really notice them in day-to-day wear. But even then, it is pretty poorly finished. I wouldn't expect so many scratches on the hands, so many like particles on the numerals and whatnot. So it's just one of those things where at this price point, the QC should be a little bit better and the quality of the product going out should be a little bit better. Another con for me is I think the pricing. There's not a lot that I think directly compete with this watch in terms of like integrated bracelet look. You're kind of just going higher with something like a Royal Oak or a Nautilus or a Chopek, you know, but there's nothing really at that maybe $5,000 to $15,000 price point that comes to mind easily to me. So it is a weird point to talk about pricing because there's really nothing else out there like it, but I do think it's slightly high, again, taking into consideration the finishing, taking into consideration it can be a little bit plain at times, but it still is well made, well engineered, so it shouldn't be a $5,000 watch, but I also don't think it should be a $12,000 watch. And then just a personal con for me, again, I do think the watch is just a little bit big. I don't know how small they could go on the design anyway because it is a very large movement. It is one of the very few watches that actually look like it was designed, and having a movement that fits the design and actually takes up a big portion of the case back. So it's one of those things where maybe they can make a 39, maybe they can make a 38, I'm not sure. But for a smaller wrist like mine, a sub 40 millimeter size would work a lot better just because squares do tend to wear larger. Will it work on someone with a 7-inch wrist or 7.5-inch wrist or even 8-inch wrist really, really great? Probably. But for me, it doesn't look as great in my opinion, and it is a little bit overpowering for my wrist. So final thoughts on this watch, and it is a watch I really wanted to like because it is so unique. And it's not that I don't like the watch, it's just that I was slightly disappointed by it. Again, the finishing isn't great. The wearability, not there at least for me, but I kind of knew that going into it anyway. It's just one of those things where it's a very, I guess, modern design. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you have to be into that styling and be willing to cough up a little money to pay for it as well. At the end of the day, does it deserve to be a luxury product? Does it deserve a luxury price? Yes. But there are plenty of kind of quality of life improvements. There are plenty elements they can improve upon to not only justify the price, but maybe even make it a better deal. I'm sure as this Octo range grows over time, there's going to be more things added, more refinement added over time, and I'm excited to see what the Octo range looks like 10 years from now. And I'm sure they're going to hit the nail on the head at some point because they do have a very, very good starting point. The watch definitely makes a statement. It definitely looks high-end. It has that feel about it. And overall, if you just like the design, can't fault you for that. It's a good-looking watch. So you just have to be aware that there are some pitfalls to the watch. There's arguably better stuff out there for the money, but even that being said, there's not really much in that integrated styling that is of this level. So if the watch fits you and you just like the look of it, it's a cool one. I might suggest trying to find one used because they do depreciate a pretty good amount, but even then, if you love it, it's a cool watch and you should get it. Those are just my thoughts. Thank you for watching. Hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you in another one.